Good morning, everyone. So this, all right, now, good morning, everyone. My name is Ronna Brown. I'm president of Philanthropy New York, and welcome to this program, which is really an incredibly interesting program. I'm so excited to have you all here. You notice I'm talking to a mic, but there's no, amplification. That is because we are webcasting this. For this room, we don't really need mics. If you can't hear me and I have a loud voice, just say so. But for the folks online, the mics are working. So we're all talking into mics, which looks a little weird, even though there's no more sound. When you all ask questions or make comments, either if it's a short one, I'll just repeat it, or if you have a longer comment and we are really fast and speedy, we will get you a mic and ask that you speak into it as well. So we are ready to roll. We have this completely amazing panel, and I say that we always have really wonderful folks who are here doing programs. When you look at the bios of this group, it's incredibly impressive. I'm encouraging you all to read it. I cannot possibly do them justice. But before we start with the panel and have the conversation about policy, I want to just briefly set the stage and then ask you all to jump in just a little bit to get us started. We at Philanthropy New York put policy in our last strategic plan, which we are just completing this month, our last 3-year plan. And our goal was to really start working with members more and more who were talking about the use of public policy, how they were using it either to leverage the work they were doing, how they saw it as core to their mission. Our new strategic plan, which we have put up on our website and our board has just approved, and was heavily drafted by a former Philanthropy New York staff person, Jason McGill. Welcome, Jason. It's your new hat on. Now that we've thoroughly embarrassed you, we'll move on. Our new plan, which is on our website, also really takes our public policy work to the next step. It is our goal to help all of our members who are engaged in policy both do it well, work with each other, and understand all the different ways that they can, quote, engage in policy. And that's really what led to this program. It was Michael's idea, Michael Romali, who's the Vice President of Public Policy here, down at the end of the table. He noticed that when we kept going and talking to members about the policy work they did, they all talked about it with the same language, but then as they defined it, it turned out to be somewhat different. So we realized that would be a very interesting conversation to ask 4 foundations who are deeply enmeshed in policy work to come and talk about it, and for all of us to be able to understand some of the differences, how they all have set different parameters, how they are looking at it differently in their own foundations. In order to start us off today, I thought I would ask that whoever here wants to share why you came and what you're hoping to learn, very briefly. And because we are doing this as a webcast, I would also ask people to make sure to say your name when you speak. And I know I'm just opening up and there can be dead silence, in which case that's fine. If you're all feeling too shy to share why you're here on a cold winter morning, that's okay. But I thought it would be helpful just to get a couple of ideas from folks, and then we can have that in our minds right before the panelists start speaking. So who is willing to be one of the first, other than me, to say something this morning? Really? You're all going to be shy?
This is a little embarrassing.
Janet.
We're the second, we're the second oldest public policy think tank in the United States, started by Edward Filene's basement, and he was pretty hopping mad that people could not get a leg up economically in this country, and he was pretty ticked off that Woodrow Wilson did not approve the League of Nations, so he also required us to have a foreign policy program.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share anything? I'm going to see one more person. Thank you. Oh, yes. Go ahead and start. We'll not be too awkward for this.
We're national funder based here in New York. We are interested in improving the health of older adults. We've just now raised policy and communications through a strategic plan as its own strategy area, our own funding portfolio that I'll be taking on. So we are exploring all the different kinds of policy activities that might be a part of that portfolio. So I'm interested in hearing the variety and what might be available in terms of our work going forward.
Thank you. All right, if no one else wants to raise their hand at this point, your moment will come again shortly. So, thank you, Jason. Thank you. I'm going to ask Kenneth to start us off by talking about some of the research that the Wallace Foundation has been doing and explain how that came about. And I am going to be one of those moderators who tries to not rudely tell people when their time is up, because really the core of what we want to do after we hear from each of our speakers today is to have ample opportunity for both the audience and the speakers to ask one another questions about their policy work. But first, we want everyone to set the stage a little bit by explaining how they define public policy. And in addition to that, and I'll say it when each person starts, we have asked them to focus on one particular aspect of their policy work, and it's really amazingly different between all of them. Kenneth, however, is going to start us off and really ground us in what Wallace is doing right now. And so thank you. Over to Kenneth.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Kenneth Austin, Senior Counsel of the Wallace Foundation. And I want to thank you, Ronna, for the invitation to come speak to this group this morning. This is a really great opportunity to have an in-depth conversation about something that I'm sure we're all grappling with in our own way. So I did bring some slides. You know, you have to have slides when you do these research presentations. So I think I've lost some of my formatting on the bullets, but
we apologize.
So today's presentation, I want to begin by describing our approach. And by our approach, I'm talking about our theory of change, and that is the Wallace approach. How we are reviewing our engagement in policy and what we've learned through our literature review and the process wrapped around the literature review in order to share some preliminary lessons that may be helpful to folks here and those who are participating in the webinar. I should point out that we really learned an awful lot from other funders, including some of the folks in this room, during the course of researching the literature review. So this is our approach, but we've learned an awful lot from others. Okay, so the Wallace approach. For years, Wallace has worked to inform public policy in our areas of interest. We do this by developing and then sharing evidence-based information and ideas. Let me illustrate this by our decade-plus work in school leadership, also known as ed leadership. So in all of our work, we start by trying to understand the context and identify what we call a high leverage knowledge gap. That is something that is not known, which, if known, could propel social progress. In this case, in the case of ed leadership, it was how can we get school principals we need in order to drive improved student achievement, which ultimately is the goal. Next, we work with our grantee partners both to help them test new ideas and generate improvements, and to build insights and evidence on what worked and what did not work. On ed leadership, we work with 24 states and numerous large urban districts and commission research. We then seek to share widely what we and our partners have learned. In the case of ed leadership, it was more than 70 reports, so that the broader field can benefit from our learnings. And knowing that the credibility of the evidence is a critical factor in catalyzing the improvement of policy and practice on a broad scale, we intentionally design our initiatives from the beginning to create robust and useful insights and data. We conceive of our approach as a cycle. So you'll see it really is a cycle that we operate in, because experience has shown that what we learn in one round of this process often leads to new questions that become the focus of additional initiatives or rounds of grants. And you'll see in our policy work and the literature review that we started with a number of known unknowns, but we ended up also looking at unknown unknowns. So when we get to that point, we'll talk about that a little more. We ask ourselves a simple question. What are we doing in our grant-making program that has the potential to make a meaningful difference for those working in this area who will never get their eye from Wallace? So that is really the main question that we ask ourselves. Now let's just turn to give a little context around our public policy work, and then we'll move into the literature review and what we've learned. We think we have been able to make a difference and reach those beyond our funding. We are often credited by field leaders with helping to put leadership on the map, so to speak. For example, for the second term of this administration, the U.S. Department of Education has made leadership, in this case school leadership, its top priority. So while that's a good thing, despite these accomplishments, we wanted to see if there was something more that we could do, for example, forming coalitions or promoting a specific policy. And in furtherance of that, I was brought on board earlier to lead an effort to consider our options for engaging public policy more explicitly and more consistently across all areas of our work. So it's been a four-step review process. Now, when we started this, we didn't know it was going to be exactly 4 steps, and it's been iterative. But I started by forming and now leading the internal task force. We call it Policy Engagement Resource Team. We really call it PERT for short. We have set out to develop common language and improved understanding of our past areas of work in this area. Also, to create a strategic framework, including a set of principles to guide public policy activity, and analysis of the potential risks involved. Now, you may want to say, what have we learned? What has Wallace learned? Okay. We have learned that terms had varied meanings, as Ronna mentioned earlier, so we set out to define them clearly for Wallace. Hopefully that translates to the outside world, but we wanted to understand for Wallace what some of these terms meant. So going to the known unknown, we started out by looking at what do we mean by policy, and we decided policy means public policy. And we defined public policy broadly to include an action taken by a government entity or its representatives to address an issue through laws, regulations, enforcement priorities, and or programs. Now, I mentioned unknown unknowns. The term government entity looks benign enough, but it turns out that that in itself was something that I spent a lot of time researching, because we wanted to know if districts, schools, charter schools, which types of schools were included in the term government entity. So that was clearly an unknown unknown. We defined policymakers to include those who set policy and those who implement it. We also recognize the important role of policy influencers, even if they're not policymakers. We then decided to define advocacy for ourselves, and we define advocacy to mean influencing the public policy process through individual or group action, noting that foundations are not prohibited from this work unless it involves lobbying or influencing elections. Foundations cannot lobby, however, they have more latitude than they often think, and this is important. They can provide supports to groups that do lobby, although not necessarily for the activity, the lobbying activity itself, and they can share results of objective, nonpartisan analysis. We also wanted to develop a shared understanding of the policy process itself, and here there were many paths that were open to us. I'm going to go through these few slides quickly, but the classic stage-based model makes it clear that the process takes time and that it often begins with problem definition and agenda setting, two areas where foundations have particular strength. but we found it didn't fully capture the complex nature of the process itself. We then turned to the advocacy coalition model. This model pointed to the key role of coalitions, implying that we needed to know who else was out there working on a particular issue at a particular time. We decided then to look further, and we looked at the work of Charles Lindblom, who's a distinguished scholar in this area, and others, that underscores the ongoing role of negotiation and compromise. In the last bullet there, you'll see attention to relevant information, which is a particular focus for Wallace, but this is also seen as one element among several. Well, we finally settled on John Kingdon's notion of the policy window framework as most useful. Now, we did modify it a bit for our purposes, but policy windows are opportunities for influence over policy that occur unpredictably when there is a favorable confluence of three things. First, priority. These are matters of sufficient concern to a critical mass of policy setters, implementers, and influencers to make action possible. Second, feasible solutions, policy proposals with evidence of success. And three, insufficient opposition, the inability of those opposing the proposed policy change to block it. The framework suggests foundations can contribute to progress in each element, especially in elevating priority and feasible solutions. Now, I mentioned risk earlier. Risk is often the key barrier blocking foundations for more intensive policy engagement. We at Wallace identified 5 classes of risks that we would need to anticipate and to address. They range from unwanted controversy to the risk of breaking the law. And they are reputational risk, opportunity cost risk, risk of policy failure, risk of harm, and legal risk. The opportunity cost risk, risk of policy failure, risk of harm, I should just point out, are strategic risks. And then we've got the reputational and the legal risk, which we've also looking at how that connects to our own enterprise risk management foundation. So what does this all add up to? So this really all added up to 4 implications for Wallace. The first is in terms of time horizon. We need a long time horizon. We don't do policy quickly. We need to be adaptable. We should think about contribution, not attribution. And finally, we need to understand our own risk tolerance. So as I wind up, what's next, you might ask? So here, what I'm really doing is giving you a quick sense of the process that we've been through. Immediate next steps will be to identify a process to guide our decision-making in the public policy area. We will also train staff and continue to engage our board. And by training, I don't just mean legal training, but we'll also look at understanding across the foundation these definitions that the policy engagement research team has developed, and look at risk management and how that needs to be handled. And then long-term, our goal is to contribute to effective policy by sharing evidence-based lessons. And at the same time, we will manage the associated risk and closely monitor changing context for public policy, because it's always what's the case today in any area that we're looking at will be tomorrow. And overall, I want to say, as I thought, that we really look forward to sharing what we learn going forward with this group, and also learning from each of you. And so I'm really glad to hear that from Ronna that we're going to have an opportunity, part of the strategic plan for philanthropy, to engage in this people way. So thank you very much.
Kenneth, thank you. And I think, what's so interesting about what you all have done is you've been doing public policy for a long time. So sort of taking this moment and stopping and doing this sort of reflective and engaging in the exercise of really trying to understand it is an interesting thing for the foundation to have done. I know you are creating a document. At some point in the future, will there be a document you can share with others?
Okay, good question. So what I will say is we have a literature review which we have developed for internal purposes. If anyone here would like a copy of that, give me your card and I will email you a copy of our literature review, which was completed in July.
Great. Thank you very much. So that was very helpful to kind of set the stage about how one foundation is really looking at policy and setting out definitions. We then asked each of the next speakers to both define policy for their own foundation and then to focus on a specific thing. And, you know, it is kind of funny, we've set you up in the order we're going, and that seems like I should have done something more interesting, right? But Desiree is next from the Arcus Foundation. And in addition to defining policy for your foundation, I'd also like you to talk about how you think about community and use that as a core definition in terms of doing your work.
So, right up here into this microphone. For those of you on the webinar, I am 5'8", and no, so it's really great to be here today, Ronna. Thanks so much for the invite. Yeah, so just a little bit about me. As Ronna mentioned, I am at the Arcus Foundation. I'm the U.S. Social Justice Director there, and I have been there for, gosh, a handful of months since the spring. I'm part of almost an entirely new program team that came into the foundation at that time, and I have the great fortune of working with Jason, who just came on as well to round out our team. And I also, I come to Arcus after about a decade at the Miss Foundation for Women, a public foundation where I managed our portfolios around reproductive justice, women and AIDS, and sex ed in schools. And all of that funding was really targeted to community-based and state-based organizing advocacy groups, all towards policy work. So it's incredibly wonderful to be here. It's something I have a lot to say. I think we have 5 minutes.
Yes, I should. And I know everyone else try to do it in 5 minutes so that we could really then get to the conversation.
Yes, but it's subject that's near and dear to my heart. And so actually is, I'll say that where I'll start, instead of defining policy for the Arcus Foundation, I actually, Ken, what you put on your slide, I mean, sounds good to me. This is a really tough thing. I mean, I think that the backdrop of this whole event really is, you can sort of define it in many ways, but I think, at Arcus, and actually, just as a quick headline, so the Arcus Foundation is a private foundation about 12, 13 years old that focuses on LGBT culture and policy change, and also conservation of the Great Apes. And we really see those two linked as really, having interest in the dignity of all human life. And so I work on the LGBT side, and with our U.S. program, again, we're focused on long-term culture and policy change. And, so the approach we take is really around, the fact that we really can't divorce policy from the lived experience of the folks that we are putting at the center of our work, and the American electorate writ large, really. We are intently focused on our two target communities, youth and communities of color, and at the middle of that Venn diagram, youth of color. And so we are, always looking for ways to even more authentically, more strategically, really get to support work that's really led by and for those communities. I think also, Jay, I think of approaching policy work at a foundation as the importance of really keeping 3 P's at the center of that work: people, power, and persuasion. So policies, they kind of aren't just implemented out of the blue. I mean, it's Ken said, a lot of work, sometimes years and years. But that really, I always like to remind myself that people who are in positions of power to enact policies, more often than not, are in by people, by constituents, and they're moved by people and votes and money. And so, the more that I think foundations, as flexible or not as they are, you know, can really support whatever policies they're looking to affect. They can really support their grantees to do very smart, integrated civic engagement, civic participation, integrated voter engagement, all throughout their work over the long term. You know, I just think that it's the smart way to go, because it really does ensure that, you know, over time, you are helping to grow a bases of power that whoever is in office, well, that really they have the power to, you know, vote people in or out, given what they do or don't do, all in a C3 way, of course. And then, so people of power, persuasion, people, you know, the power to do what I just said, and then, you know, the persuasion to kind of be able to increase constituencies, get other people into your base, and be able to persuade those in power to act the way you want them to. You know, and at Arcus, we talk a lot about the years 2030 and 2042 and how important they are, given that youth and communities of color are at the center of all of our work. I mean, you know, by 2030, U.S. residents under 18 and under are poised to become, you know, majority youth of color, and by 2042, majority of U.S. residents people of color. And so, you know, those are, you know, I heard a stat the other day that, you know, 50,000 Latinos turn 18 every month in this country. I mean, that is tremendous. And to, I think, you know, to be doing policy work without sort of those years and those numbers and that reality as a backdrop, I think we do that at our own peril. And so, you know, with a few minutes. Okay, we're coming to the end. All right. I'll talk to you after. So
that's actually not my goal. But this will not be the only time you have a chance to talk to us this morning.
I don't know, maybe it's like there's a correlation between being short and talking faster and walking faster. You kind of feel like we have to like everything goes faster. So I will. So I have a few other points that I'm sure we'll get to in the Q&A, but you know, just a few other quick points that I wanted to talk about in terms of how we're talking about policy at Arcus is, you know, we being a new team that's implementing a new strategic plan with these very clear target communities at the center of our work, you know, we talk a lot about the importance of, you know, if we're supporting a particular policy effort or campaign, of course we want that policy or that effort to win, but that just as important, if not even more important to us, is, you know, making sure that whatever effort we're supporting, that even if the policy doesn't win in this cycle or, you know, next cycle, that there is some evidence that we have supported new, increased, diverse, you know, racially, generationally, alliances, coalitions, efforts that weren't there before, because we just really truly believe that really is going to be the key in again looking over the long term and making sure that we're fortifying a base that will sustain the wins that we've made, and then also continue to win, you know, over the long term. So I'll do the rest of
Fabulous. Thank you very much. And that is a great addition, really, to what Kenneth started us off with, as a sort of digging in a little deeper with the specific foundation's point of view. And I know this seems harsh that we're kind of moving folks along so quickly. It's really because we want to make sure there's a lot of time for conversation and for you all to have a chance to share your thoughts and your questions. So Ken Zimmerman, Open Society Foundation. And I haven't really introduced folks much because you all have these fabulous bios and you can see their backgrounds, but do share, as the other speakers have, what's particularly relevant in terms of how you think about policy, but also if you can, in talking about how the Open Society Foundation focuses on policy and what your goals are or definitions, if you can also touch on the use of C4s, that would be great.
So thanks, Ronna, for having me. I'm also 5'8", for those of you on the Kenneth and I have decided to make it easy. He's Kenneth, I'm Ken. He's A, I'm Z. You know, it's easy on multiple strands. So I'm really going to just try to do 4 things. briefly describe a little bit of where I come from and why, to me, this issue is interesting because I have such a difficult time distinguishing between policy and everything else we do, just to put that out there. Second, to talk about OSF a little bit and why that actually fits within the culture that we have, in large part because of George Soros. Talk specifically about a specific initiative we have having to do with voting rights, and then just add with some final comments that I think are interesting jumping off points. I should say, as my bio suggests, I'm a civil rights lawyer by background and training. I'm relatively new to philanthropy, having been the head of U.S. programs at OSF for about 18 months. But before that, I was not in philanthropy at all, done a variety of things over the course of my time, including a bunch of time in politics. I spent some time as a governor, as a counsel to a governor in the Obama administration early on, ran a nonprofit in Newark. And so to me, part of why I love these conversations is they give me insights into the way different people think about it. It does mean, though, that for me, that there's an artificiality if we're really looking about how we influence the society around us in response to the goals we have, between distinguishing between policy, however defined, and the rest of the things that we're doing. I mean, the social movements we may invest in, the particular programs we may invest in. In many respects, the way I and my folks talk about it is that both politics and policy is the water in which we swim. We will take on particular dynamics of that in a particular context, depending upon what we seek to achieve. But at the same time, to divorce anything we're doing from the issues of policy and politics, in many respects, seems to us artificial. It doesn't mean that in each and every circumstance we're going to take on those. We'll make strategic choices or tactical choices. But that is the starting point that we have in much of what we do. My good colleague, or former colleague, Ricardo Castro, former general counsel of OSF, has lived much of his life in the particular dynamics of OSF in that regard. In many respects, I just want to say, Open Society Foundation, I suspect most of you know, but is George Soros' foundation. I just want to say that the phrase open society is not a branding phrase in any way, shape, or form. It stems from George's own experience growing up in Hungary as a Hungarian Jew, facing the experience of Nazism and totalitarianism. So our starting point is a deep belief that we are seeking in the United States to promote a democratic, inclusive society. Many of the things that Desiree talked about in terms of demographic change are at its heart. And our core areas around equality, which looks at everything from immigration reform to the plight of young black males, to democratic practice, voting, independent journalism, justice in terms of the over-reliance and mass incarceration in the society, all stem from ways in which we're trying to promote the kind of inclusive society that's not distorted by influences that prevent everybody from having full range and access to quality cultural, civic, and economic opportunities in this country. With that said, there are two aspects of OSF I just want to note, and then I'll talk a little bit about the voting rights example. And the first is that of our budget of about $125 million a year in domestic spending, a fifth of it is left unreserved at the beginning of the year as a fund that we can shift and move in response to opportunities that are not previously identified. So to offer some examples, in the aftermath of the 2012 election, when we believed for the first time there was an opportunity to move comprehensive immigration reform, those funds were available to be moved in a fashion to advance a specific opportunity. And I do believe Kenneth is right in terms of opportunity being one, not the only, but one of the watchwords that we are always attempting to balance. I mean, in many respects, we view the ability to be nimble and opportunistic on one hand, as opposed to being strategic and long-term as a tension that we want to live in as much as we possibly can. It's not an either or, both are necessary, but trying to figure out how you do both of those things become a core element of the way in which we spend our work, and we undertake our work. The second, as Ronna mentioned, is that, in my view, we are very fortunate that in terms of the constellation of organizations that are part of OSF, in addition to our C3 grant making, we have a C4 entity. And I assume most of you are generally familiar with it. I'll defer to Ricardo to go into greater detail. But the significance of the Open Society Policy Center is that it is an entity that is not subject to the same legal issues that Kenneth outlined in terms of it being able to provide funding that is directly related to much of the lobbying that a C3 entity cannot do. I want to come back to a caveat in that, because I do think many foundations overstate the significance of that legal limitation in terms of the grants that they can make and what those grants can be used for. But it certainly means that for us, the ability to have a C4 entity, the ability within the legal constraints to understand what our C4 is doing, and frankly, I'm on the board of the C4, to understand the way in which our staff can be designated as part of the C4 for certain purposes, gives us more tools in the toolbox as we think about how we move policy in a variety of ways. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to come back to that at greater depth. But to give a concrete example, I identified, a couple of the opportunities that we sometimes see. It may be an election, which opens up to a new elected leader, an opportunity that we think takes place. We're doing a lot of work, for example, in the aftermath of President Obama's speech, in the aftermath of the Trayvon Martin verdict, about the way in which a national campaign around the fight of black males might be advanced. Sometimes there will be things, such as CIR, comprehensive immigration reform. But the specific example I'll talk about is the response to the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County. For those of you who don't follow this stuff, this is where the Supreme Court struck down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, something that is of great significance to us because of our belief that having full participation in the electoral system is actually a prerequisite to the kind of democratic society that we want. When the Supreme Court struck this down, I should say we've been doing substantial grant making in the voter engagement, the voting rights area for a long period of time. But it raised the question, because of the way in which the legal decision was structured, that the Justice Department was no longer going to be reviewing in many states throughout the country changes in voting practice. And this to us is a very alarming development. So what we did as we think about policy is realize there are multiple facets to what might occur. And in conjunction with our good friends at the Ford Foundation and many others, developed with a large number of other foundations, something we're calling the Shelby Response Fund, that will ultimately be placed in a funding collaborative. But it had as its goal really 4 key elements in terms of developing a funding collaborative that would provide money in one area was going to be increasing litigation resources, because we believe litigation ultimately to challenge bad voting practices was one tool that needed to be done. And I should just mention, in terms of, I think, Kenneth's appropriate definition, litigation does not run afoul in any way, shape, or form of any of the C3 restrictions. And I think that's a very important point, since many people can shy away from litigation. Just note that is actually full-fledged act. There are other dynamics when one talks about reputational risk and the like, but nonetheless, there are no legal risks with regard to that. Second was a recognition that there could be a federal legislative effort to reverse the Shelby decision. And I want to emphasize that while for us, we were the only funder in this collaborative that had a C4 entity, most of them are C3 entities. And so the educational function, the mobilization function, all could play, even if one of the goals was a federal legislative outcome. Now, they couldn't invest directly in lobbying, as was suggested, but that was a second goal. Third was a recognition that mobilization on the ground in states and localities where potentially adverse voting practices were going to be raised could be key. So community organizing, the idea that groups who may not currently have been focused on voting practices, religious organizations and the like, would be very interested in joining forces to potentially see what was happening and influence it, was a third strategy, and the fourth was strategic patience. And so, I'm going through this in obviously very short order, but I hope it's an indication for some ways how we think about policy change in a very concrete and immediate example. I do want to emphasize, though, that short-run intervention is not the only way. I think the points about long-term investments are absolutely critical, but I did want to offer something that I thought was relatively concrete. Let me conclude with just sort of 3 jumping off points for our future conversation. I really want to emphasize, especially for, I presume, almost everybody here, or everybody here is a C3 funder, that the need to look seriously at how much one can do in terms of trying to influence legislation, even that area that's at the core of the concerns people have, is much greater than many people think about. I do recommend Kenneth's paper, which he was kind enough to share with us, that I think does a good job. But whether you are funding other organizations, with a bifurcated budget, to go ahead and be able to allow them to do some of that. But even beyond that, the idea that one can educate, one can actually meet with legislators with expertise one has under certain circumstances, all of that is fair game. And I think we sell ourselves short in this conversation if we artificially back farther away than we need to from the legal line that can be drawn. Second, when we think about the kinds of things that can be done in terms of advancing policy, I look forward to the conversation that suggests there's a lot that's there, and I'll just mention 5 of them that we can jump off on. The credibility of the foundation community, the idea that we're not private corporations with self-interest in the same way, is an important and incredibly valuable asset that we can bring to the table when well used. As somebody who spent time on the other side of the aisle continually being lobbied, fairly quickly one develops an antenna for why is somebody, darkening my hallway. And it doesn't take much frequently to actually have somebody who is coming in because they believe it's the right thing to do. Doesn't mean that you will necessarily get listened to, but it means that you are actually frequently given an audience that others will not be. And you can't be naive. You can't simply say it's the right thing to do and that's sufficient. Political factors and the ability to understand those political factors are hugely important and something that I would urge all of us to do. But nonetheless, that credibility is significant. The convening power was just talked about enormously critical, because frequently in the policy realm, the multiplicity of voices is going to be key, and if those are in very different places, very tough to get movement. If there's actually consensus or a coalition that can be formed, much easier to move it, and that is something that is in the sweet spot of philanthropy. Evaluation and the ability to provide data. While our politics doesn't always focus on data, however much I wish it were otherwise, it does at times. And arguments that are made based on good information that can be explained and distilled in very concrete form to people whose attention span is frequently measured in nanoseconds, is an incredibly useful. And actions at the end of the day. I mean, I do think that sometimes we can focus on developing policy papers. I'm a policy wonk, so I love all of that. But don't forget that the way in which policymakers sometimes respond is to the number of people who are actually influential or desiring change of a certain kind. And so moving beyond simply the policy into the way in which people on the ground move is enormously useful. And then finally, ideas. In and of themselves, good ideas, insights, new opportunities, all of these are ones that frequently overburden policymakers, don't have the opportunity to take the step back and the really privileged position all of us are in, to have a longer term time horizon, and not to be in the hurly-burly of a 24-hour news cycle is a great advantage. And then finally, I think, Kenneth raised in his paper something that I do think is a core question that we grapple with a lot, which is from a policy advocacy or policy development perspective, how much should we do ourselves in terms of foundation work, and how much should we really be strengthening our grantees to do that work? And again, this isn't a yes-no question. It's not like there's a right answer. Every foundation will have its own culture, and I think it's really important to be faithful to that culture. But I think being mindful of that question, understanding there's both opportunities and risks, whichever choice you make, and being able to distill those and be consistent with what makes sense from your own perspective is a critical question that we keep coming back to as we go forward.
Thank you. Thank you. That was fabulous. I think, that question is one of the ones that we've talked about, and we're going to come back to once we have completed this cycle of this. And what I'd like to ask each of you to be thinking about is one of the examples you can use of where you either empowered a grantee and later thought there would have been a better way to do that, or the other direction, where in fact the foundation was taking activity that in hindsight you thought had we used grantees or a coalition of grantees that might have been more effective. Ricardo, thank you. The Ricardo Castro Ford Foundation, and as you have now been kind of introduced, previously OSF and also in your bio, what I'd like to ask you to do, and I appreciate asking very complex institutions to briefly define what you're doing as public policy is near impossible, so I do understand that. But nonetheless, take a stab at it, and if you could add something about the fact that Ford really works in an international venue and how that influences the way you all think about the work that you're doing.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So I have been at the Ford Foundation for a total of 8 months. I previously spent 16 years working at the Open Society Foundation, the last 10 of which I was its general counsel. And I very much see my role as a foundation lawyer to get people across the finish line in terms of doing the policy work and the advocacy work and making sure that they feel enabled to conduct that work within the parameters of the regulations, which, as Ken and others have said, actually permit much more advocacy and policy work than I think people are sometimes aware of. So I don't think after 8 months I can define for the Ford Foundation, which has been around for 80 years, how it defines policy necessarily, although I think it's pretty clear that Ford is a social justice funder, and the sorts of issues that it concerns itself with are issues that don't lend themselves necessarily to quick fixes. If you're focused on racial justice, if you're focusing on making educational and economic opportunities available to the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in our society, these are long-term issues that require thoughtful and long-term investments. So, and I think at the core of that, the sorts of issues that we deal with really is the issue of systemic change. And I think Kenneth mentions systemic change as being a driver for the policy work of many foundations, and I think that is very true. So you asked also to talk about how we see community, and I think one of the very important elements of Ford's approach, and of OSF's as well, which also works a lot internationally, is local knowledge, is reliance on local knowledge and on local stakeholders who are closest to the issues that we may be trying to address, and a reliance on them, really, with our assistance to define the agenda and to define the best approaches. And in terms of best approaches, I think that the best approach will be defined by the specific issue and policy matter that you're trying to pursue. And there are many different approaches. So, for instance, at the Ford Foundation, there are 3 large areas of programming. One is in the field of education, creativity, and free expression. Another is in the area of democracy, rights, and justice. And another is in economic opportunity and assets. And in all of these areas, Ford and the various initiatives beneath those large categories of policy work and advocacy work figures very prominently in the work that is supported. So, for instance, in the field of education, something that we're spending a lot of time working on is more and better learning, right? Because research that we supported in one way or another, has found that more and better learning time results in better outcomes for kids, particularly kids of color in poor communities, right? So that becomes a policy question, because what you're trying to do ultimately is to get governments to allocate funds for that and to take that up as a responsibility of their own, right? So there's a great deal of advocacy that goes on there, which, how do we support that? Well, we have some expertise of our own in-house, so we're called upon to share that expertise in ways that are appropriate under the regulations, technical assistance, et cetera, as an exception to the lobbying rules. But, you know, convenings, that's a very important way to promote policy priorities, right? Creating networks. People have mentioned coalitions. Connecting the dots, right? There are many people in different fields that we care about where people are working sort of in isolation and don't really know what others are doing and the power that they could have if they were acting jointly. So creating those networks is very, very important. So it will really depend, and the level at which you will engage in the advocacy and the policy work will depend on the issue. So the issue I mentioned earlier on more and better learning time, that's an issue that you would need to conduct policy work on the very local level, right? Given the way schools are financed in this country, right? You may be doing policy work on the very district level. Then you may be doing policy work on the state level. And of course, you may also be doing policy work on the federal level, right? And again, that's through the various mechanisms that I mentioned before. Now, on the international front, we had a very recent example in Kenya where there was an urgent need for a lot of policy work because the government was trying to push through some changes to the NGO law that would have resulted in a 15% limitation on foreign funding to any NGO in Kenya. So that would clearly be very devastating for a lot of NGOs in Kenya, particularly those that work on human rights related issues or rights-based matters. So that took a lot of advocacy work, largely, again, of course, driven by the civil society groups locally. And the approach was very much defined by those groups. And it made a great deal of sense, particularly in that context, that the international donors not be at the front of that struggle because it would have just fed into the very arguments that the government was making, the conspiracy arguments about international donors, et cetera. So that was a very grassroots policy effort or advocacy effort, which also actually involved trying to figure out helpful and more subtle and nuanced ways to get the broader international community to weigh in, et cetera. So that's just another example there. Another area of concern to the Ford Foundation is the availability of economic opportunities. So we have been focusing a lot on low-wage workers in the United States, particularly. Those who work at McDonald's, and we've seen some recent activity as recently as this past week on this issue, but supporting restaurant opportunity centers, right? Well, why is that a policy issue? Well, it's a policy issue because those groups are very much advocating for a more fair distribution of wages, right? And there are many ways in which we have supported that effort, including, incidentally, supporting research. There's a lot of important research that shows that actually paying better wages to the low wage earners is actually has a stimulative effect, right, for the economy. And businesses start to hear that and it resonates, and there is some evidence to support it. So there are many different mechanisms you can use to support the ultimate policy goal.
Thank you very much. So I want people to start thinking about the questions you want to ask or the comments you want to make given this conversation. And as I'm not surprised to say there are, 40 different directions we could go because we've had a very rich introduction to this conversation. But while you all are thinking about some of the directions you want to take the conversation, I'm going to ask if any of you are willing to talk about policy decision the organization made or a tactic or a strategy that in hindsight your evaluation and reflection where you should have gone a different direction, and then you, of course, use that as a learning experience for your foundation. And I will remind everyone, and many of you have been here multiple times, we are one of those places that we call a safe space. And what that means, particularly this morning, and we have people online, but they're online in the webinar and they are members, is that you can have these conversations and share the learning with the knowledge that it is staying within the community of people who are having the conversation. It is not going to be tweeted. No one is going to see this in any other publication or place. So with that reminder, or hopefully, safeguard makes you feel able to share some of that with us. Thank you, Desiree.
I'll do it too for actually quick story about a lesson learned through a program at the Ms. Foundation that is similar to an approach that we recently taken at Arcus. So back late 90s, the Ms. Foundation created a program, the Women Made Club, that really focused on supporting HIV-positive women and women's-led organizations to come together and identify policy priorities and basically have a greater power within the larger, HIV/AIDS movement. And I had the great fortune of, being at NIS for 10 years, and with many of those grantees through that fund over the same amount of time, and many of the staff people and directors of those small organizations, there was very little turnover. So I've had this really great privilege of, kind of being in this relationship and this network over a long period of time to be able to kind of see it really grow. And when we started, the goal was, okay, let's find these leaders at community level and support them and come together and form this national policy strategy and just rebel rouse all the way. And it was a really great learning experience for us, and bringing the group together and realizing that we may have had our policy agenda, or our agenda was really to have them set an agenda and then just kind of go. But we really needed to step back and allow for a lot of healing. For many of those women, they weren't even out in their families with their status. This was the first time they were actually together with other positive women. We just needed time to talk, to heal, and also the fact that many of them in these organizations were, and they were lucky if they had one paid staff member. And their primary purpose, more often than not, was really around, basic services, being a support to other positive women in their communities, to even just say, here's the questions you ask your doctor, here's where you go, here's where you can go to not, maybe outside of town where you don't want people to see you going. So it was a really great early lesson in, I think, how to sort of have an authentic dance with grantees that you're bringing together for a particular sort of long-term movement building, network building purpose. And so fast forward 10+ years, and many of those women had a very big role in setting the national AIDS policy agenda, and are now very prominently on the Administration Policy Council. So you really were able to see, and not just by us, and other foundations that had a huge part in that, so that arc of the story around, how you can meaningfully, with and support groups led by and for the community that you're trying to support. And at Arcus, what we actually just brought together last month a very first convening of transgender, mostly people of color, to come together. And I mean, a lot of folks kind of know each other, but it was really the first time that folks were kind of intentionally brought together. And for the T of LGBT is really kind of 30 years behind, the larger movement. And so, and we oversampled actually for trans women of color in that group. And so to sort of see now that process kind of starting, really, it's, you know, we kind of brought folks together. This is really, you know, the intention is really kind of listening and learning and figuring out, all right, you kind of tell us, you know, what, how you see an agenda working for you over the long term.
So that's a great example. So two of the things that many of you have talked about, both the power of convenience, which I think we often underplay, and the need for the long haul. So in addition to, you know, the core message, so thank you. Ken.
Yeah, it was good. I've been there 18 months, and so I was pleased that I had to rack my brain a little bit about something that I think I've screwed up already. So I view that as, but two points. One, before actually offering an example, I really like that we're keeping up this slide of Kenneth's as background here, because, you know, to me, before talking about a specific example, the recognition that we don't control the policy environment, and so that when we start in on something, the likelihood that we're going to get what we want, at least in the form that we would most want it, is almost impossible to conceive of. And so I think the recognition of the complexity of the policymaking process, the recognition that we may want to raise up voices, I think we serve a great function in doing so. But, you know, we're very much involved in drug policy and watching what's happened with marijuana legalization in Washington and Colorado. Lots of we're doing a lot with stop, question, and frisk in New York City right now. What's going to happen in terms of, you know, each of these things, it's just really important, I think, to retain humility, sort of acknowledging how much will occur that you don't control. And that is part of the next expectation. But in terms of a particular example, you know, I think like a lot of foundations, we were really horrified in the aftermath of the Newtown massacres and did something that I think most of us are aware of, which is thought there was an opportunity, made a set of investments in terms of promoting an effort to reduce gun violence. And, you know, the reality is, like all of these things, it gets back to your point of the long haul, you know, it was just not something that, for many reasons, most of which were out of our control, that the kind of change that we wanted to see. You know, the field was actually less developed than we would have liked. The politics were far more complicated than most of us hoped they would be, and that there was actually much less opportunity if one actually wanted to come in a year or two to make a difference. And I think it was just another reminder of the point that people have made that there are times where one can come in short term in areas where you've been working, but frequently, however attractive it is in the heat of the moment, that's not likely to be something. And so in retrospect, I think we felt like we didn't get as much done as we would have liked.
A very interesting example, and maybe one of those where it really is about the long haul, because perhaps we have the opportunity to look back at 10 years more time.
Well, what's interesting,
sort of see the influence of what that moment
just as I mean, Ricardo knows this, but there was actually a gun violence project at OSF many years ago that was deemed actually after 3 or 4 years, just not one that we could get traction on. And I mean, what that says, and it's actually a really interesting case study, because I think there was a real deep belief that there was a field that needed to be in, and yet for multiple reasons, I can refer to, it just felt like that was not something that could be built at that time. And why that is, we'll do differently. There's some lessons to be learned.
Interesting, and I will just pull out one word that you use, humility, because it is not core to the philanthropic sector. And we all want it to be, and we talk about it and have an awareness of it, but it's really very hard, particularly in the area of politics. You know, that was a really useful point. So I'm not going to force anyone.
No, I'll say. Well, I actually have not been at Ford long enough to be able to cite a failure, but I'm sure there are some. At least one hopes there are, because we learn a lot from those as well. But I think it just raises an important question that I think in determining whether to intervene and how to intervene and when to intervene, the sort of fear of failure has to be part of the thinking, right? And you don't need to term it or phrase it rather in that sort of negative way. But I think sort of assessing possible outcomes of an intervention and assessing basically scenario planning, right? And I think that's very important to have as part of the upfront analysis before you jump into the pool, right? Because I think the basic tenet one should have in one's mind is first do no harm, right? you're going to get in it and make things worse, that's a tricky business. So just not in my current position, but in a former life, we challenged a requirement of the USAID. You may have heard of it. It was part of the HIV funding, and the government required American organizations receiving this funding to have a policy explicitly opposing prostitution. Well, we didn't quite like that at the Open Society Institute, civil libertarians that we still are, but I am too, but not there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just, yes, I have confusion. Yeah. So we fought that case because we felt, in fact, the work that we're doing around HIV prevention needs an engagement with sex workers in the different parts of the world where we're doing it. So no, we'll take your money, but we're going to sue you. And so that's what we did. And that was a pretty bold thing to do. And we won all along the way. And eventually the case made its way to the Supreme Court, at which point we all began to have heart attacks. Right?
Palpitations.
No, that's true. That's true. EMS was not summoned, but almost. But no, it really was extremely nervous-making because there was a body of law and some legal principles, legal doctrine around restrictions on government funding that we could have really made really bad law around. And so it kept me up many nights. But we won before the Supreme Court. So therefore we now can rejoice because we made great law, right? With Justice Roberts, of all people, writing the opinion, right? It's a First Amendment claim. But that just goes to illustrate that you have to be very deliberate. And, I don't think we were as deliberate at the beginning of that process and seeing what would happen down the road. We also didn't have a crystal ball and could not predict. These cases take 8 years to get to the Supreme Court, right? So we couldn't really predict who was going to be there. But it's just something to really.
Were you going to comment on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
What I was just going to go is mention about the risk. Ricardo was talking about the do no harm. And the three strategic risks that I talked about earlier, opportunity cost, risk of policy failure, and risk of harm, we pull those out. Now, some of those are things that you do regardless of whether you're engaged in a policy effort or not. But in the research, one of the key things that seems to be important to understanding the policy landscape is doing a scan at some point early on to understand if the ground is in fact fertile for the activity to try to mitigate the risk of policy failure and the risk of harm, but also, of course, you look at reputational risk as well. So those kinds of scans can be very useful.
Let me make one last comment. I don't remember what your original question was, but you used failure.
I use failure very much.
You used the word failure here.
Don't worry about that so much.
But I actually want to just say, introduce a caution about it because to take comprehensive immigration reform, and this predates me, but in 2007, 2008, there was a serious push for comprehensive immigration reform that OSF and a number of other funders were very seriously involved in. I guess one could say, as may occur this time around, that it's a failure that it wasn't passed, and I would urge us not to do that. In fact, what emerged out of the 2007, 2008 effort was a deep recognition that the field itself that was being relied upon was missing some elements. There was a lot of writing, that there wasn't a level of coordination, and there was a very savvy, I thought, philanthropic effort that I wasn't involved in, so I can say this in the aftermath, to identify where those limitations were and to engage in a very conscious, effort to strengthen them over time, so that this time around, when there was a similar push, there was a much strengthened field. And so the reason why I want to push back is that frequently you're not going to get what you want. But if and I think as a quality that certainly at OSF we talk a lot about, is the ability to perceive what's happening and to be a counterpuncher at some level, to be an analyst who tries to take advantage of the perspective we have, to understand what's happening as opposed to having a fairly linear idea of what success looks like. And I think it's complicated in lots of ways, but there's a danger when we start talking about policy that unless you get it the first time out or unless you get it in exactly the form you want, you're deemed as having not been successful. And it's just such a much more complicated realm that I wanted to introduce that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And since you've all talked about the long haul, and I'll say that again, you know, much of this is, these are the different stages on the way to some future activity. Desiree wants to make a comment, and then we're going to start asking Michael.
Just to add on that point, which I think is so important. I mean, I think of, you know, even just to think about how could we, I could have never imagined that you would have, you know, dreamers on, you know, mainstream news channels and, you know, the visuals of them, you know, organizing all these different ways, and even though there wasn't, you know, a win in a particular period of time, the importance of culture change and how we define it and how we identify it, and I think include it in our measurements of you know, and benchmarks, I think is so important because it is part of the larger narrative.
Hi, Alan Divak from the Littauer Foundation. I think that the immigration reform example is excellent, but you have to realize that 2007-2008 was the result of maybe 2 decades of sustained work of a lot of philanthropies in building immigrant rights groups. I think that was forgotten was what I think actually Desiree and Kenneth talked about was the opposition. It's like, I think these groups were for the most part working, not realizing that if not a majority, a substantial and vocal minority of the American public was against them. And I think we've been living with the consequences of this and things like the Tea Party revolt. I think what's really changed since this is, as you say, the groups have improved, they're working more strategically and they're working better, but especially they're communicating better. They're not just talking to themselves. They're not just talking to their own grassroots. They're putting forward people like the Dreamers. They're trying to change, or you know, the notion that no person is illegal, right? That the press has no longer, in large part, no longer refers to illegal immigrants. So it's trying to change the terms of the debate broadly with a view to sort of lessening the opposition and changing that piece of the environment.
Thank you. Other questions and comments?
Thanks. I'm Maureen Kozai, and I'm with the New York State Health Foundation. I was wondering if the panelists could talk a little bit more, or others in the room, about this issue of assessing your impact as an organization on policy change. If we don't have a Supreme Court decision that we can point to specifically that results from our activities, kind of in your framework, you talked a little bit about this issue of contribution versus attribution. But I think when we as foundations are sort of part of this soup of a lot of players and a lot of outside factors, it's hard to think about how we take appropriate credit, not being humble, or how we can sort of assess and quantify what we've done to make that policy change happen.
Anyone can start off. Everyone's looking at you, Desiree.
I mean, you know,
so evaluation.
Yeah, I know. You know, I think I don't think there is a perfect answer, and I think that one of the things I think is essential in doing that is, you know, along with your, you know, making data and all the ways that you're sort of, you know, doing math and asking yes or no questions of grantees to figure out, you know, kind of measuring your impact, the importance of storytelling and highlighting case studies, you know, I have always found to be incredibly important, where, you know, I may not be able to say with 100% certainty this is the exact level of work that my foundation, you know, and only my foundation, you know, can get credit for. It's just not possible. But when you're able to really tell a story around, you know, what other foundation partners you worked with, the work that you all did together, it's often, I think, something that sort of, you know, goes unnoticed. The incredible amount of organizing and strategy and advocacy that American Foundation folks do together to be able to, to get their powers that be to sign off on the work that they think is important. All of that and what worked, what didn't, within particular grant-making efforts. I think it's, as much as we can kind of have the that qualitative along with the quantitative, I've always found it to be quite powerful.
Yeah, I think this is always, of course, a difficult question, and I think different foundations deal with measuring their impact in different ways. But I think it also depends on what it is that you're involved in, and I believe some things are more susceptible to being measured than others, right? So I think Ford could look back at its history and be very happy that it had a lot of impact with the Head Start program, right? That's just part of the culture now in this country, right? So there are probably many other initiatives like that that any of us could probably look back on and say, we really chose the right horse and we bet at the right time, and there's a good outcome, right? But other things are more difficult. I always struggled with this at the Open Society Foundations because George Soros, at least at the time, he was like, evaluation, what's that? And why should we really care about that? But in some ways, I was sympathetic to him because some of the things that we were involved in. I mean, how do you measure that there is a more open society in the Czech Republic, right? Necessarily, I guess you could poll people about different things. And the arc of it is so long, right? That when do you measure, et cetera? So I think it's a complicated question, but some things are more susceptible to. So for instance, in more and better learning time, so maybe 5 years from now, we'll be able to see that too has been institutionalized across the country, right? And you can say, wow, we really had an impact on that. So.
Just two thoughts. I certainly agree with both of those, that to the extent that you can assess, it's going to have to be qualitative. But the point I'd make, and this gets into sort of self-awareness, I think, is that it's really tough to have people honestly tell you, when you're barking up the wrong tree or when your folks are actually misguided and harming more than helping. And so I like most of the work we do, right? It's getting a solid enough relationship or having somebody, whether it's in a position of leadership or an outside person, who can come back and offer some insights on what you're doing. And it's not an answer to your question, but I do think, especially in this realm, in the bubble that we all live in, trying to figure out what you can do to pierce that is important, because we can all, like many of our grantees, point to things that we know our role in it is ambiguous, and the more we can do in terms of being self-aware about exactly what we did well or not, the better. The other point I wanted to make, though, to my mind, actually is about grantees in this space, and something we're spending more time thinking about is how do we set a culture in which we're trying to avoid asking them to do things that fall within that exact same track, right? I mean, the more we press them in the policy realm to say, what is it that you did? You start ending up where they have to take credit for something that's actually a group effort. And I think we do a disservice in the policy realm when we don't acknowledge that same nuance among our grantees. At the same time, and this is something we're beginning to spend more time with, and I'd love to continue, is we're thinking more about, as opposed to saying measure it or tell us the successes, is instead saying, what are your capacities? What are those things that you now are able to do that reflect either staff expertise in the policy realm or sensitivity to the way in which policy evolves? And saying, look, at the end of the day, some of the stuff's unknowable in terms of what you did in a specific circumstance, but your capacity and expertise and sophistication in this realm is something that you should be able to explain to us. And if that exists, that's probably, at least at a minimum, a really good starting point, and maybe as much as we can really evaluate and expect you to share with us.
Did you want to add?
I'll say, Ken I think, covered so much of what I was going to say, but I will just add 2 points. One is that we are at Wallace an evidence-based foundation. And I'll just say as an aside, in the literature review, we did just unearth but we haven't done the research and probably won't. But there is a difference between foundations that have living donors in terms of their willingness to engage in risk and how they analyze the use evidence in the policy realm. And I think that actually could be a whole seminar in itself. So I'm going to put that aside. So our analysis is done. So we start with the evidence, and we won't get out ahead of the evidence in terms of thinking about policy and framing the questions. So that's one. And two, Kaufman and Campbell, who are referenced in the literature review, they really advise foundations that are engaged in this work. And I presume this would also be for the charities as well, to think about evaluation in terms of step-by-step measures of progress in the policy arena, so that you're looking at each step along the way, maybe a 10-year engagement. So you're looking also at the activities that you're engaged in step by step. And that relates to adaptability that I talked about, which is going back to looking at how do you change courses tactically and or otherwise in response to a changing environment. And Ken mentioned about, Ricardo, about looking at how you get good real-time evaluation on that in order to be able to do that. And there have been different studies, case studies of real-time evaluation and use. It has its challenges as well in terms of getting objective information that you can use to quickly change and adapt your tactics. And so these are questions. They're not necessarily answers, but the tools, finding the right tools for the right project or the right opportunity, I think is going to be a critical thing based on the literature.
He's on top. Nancy Leonard, I'm with the Groucho Memorial Fund in Connecticut, and I'm the public policy officer. I'm probably the only person in that state with that title, maybe not too common here, I don't know. But we've been engaged in policy for 20 years around education, in particular early career education. And I think that I was going to go a little bit where Ken went about grantee capacity. I think humility is something that not just starts at the end, but starts at the beginning. So understanding that your understanding even of the environment is always going to be quite limited. And so we do a lot of different things, but I think one of the main focuses is on that building capacity of others as opposed to taking it on ourselves. We are a family foundation with living family members on our board, and we are very committed to policy work. A little different than maybe what your research shows. And but when you do the capacity building, there are a couple of tools that we've come to know and admire. One of them, when I was last in this room, actually, was with the Alliance for Justice and Sue and Sue Fair, talking about the use of the Advocacy self-assessment tool, which we had developed kind of a homegrown version, and now it's become this wonderful online tool for our grantees to assess their capacity in a lot of different areas. We could really look at what does it take to create the environment of capacity, and then that we know needs to be in place in order to be able to do long-term strategy work or to be opportunistic. And you get that one chance every 7 years to really push for an advance. So that's one tool I would really recommend. The other thing we're working on with the Center for Assessment and Policy Development out of Philadelphia is a legislative climate index, really looking at what does it look like when you have a good environment within the legislature. We are state focused in Connecticut. and how do you measure that on a daily basis, and how do you feel, how can that be used by our advocates? So they're in the process of tweaking it and working with the advocates, and the hope is, and it's working through that way, is that through this partnership, it will give the advocates another tool for each year, kind of sitting down, assessing what happened. It's not about this one is not really about attribution. It doesn't go that far. It's just a recognition that we need champions. We need conversation. Conversation, as you said, doesn't go anywhere for 3 or 4 years, and then it kind of coalesces and takes off, and then maybe you get something pushed along. So that tool is really good. I think it will be really good for us. And I think that the other question I have for you to talk about that is the difference between, it's not a difference, it's sort of a continuum between technical and adaptive policy change. And we're talking a 20-year commitment, and then most of our advocates that we've been supporting for 12 to 15 years. So we're really into the adaptive side of that equation. But understanding that sometimes the technical, and I don't know if other people think of it this way, can be short-term wins along the way. But that they are not the be-all, the end-all, but just the sort of right start. So, how people balance that sort of technical and adaptive.
Thank you. Does anyone have a comment on that? Technical versus adaptive. That is. Well,
centrality of Philanthropy New York's commitment to public policy. I think you've got a great advisory board here, because you've got people who are unanimous and don't take a too timid interpretation of the federal and CC laws, which, in my experience, some funders hide behind. Right. And the other theme that came up is you really have to sort of know your field. And so the program officers, to listen locally, as you had said, Ricardo, to sort of add value. And, Ken, you mentioned reputational capital. Sometimes I think the money is less important than you can say the foundation made you do it. And sort of, if you're willing to sort of get into sort of political scraps. And I think that that's pretty important. So I imagine it takes a long time. Obviously, Wallace has sort of studied this field for a very long time, and has done very, very good work in this area. And you want people who sort of walk those paths, who know how to manage mission and margin and how to negotiate those things. And I think so. The program staff are really sort of an added value to the work. And an argument can be made that maybe it's even more valuable than the money itself.
I think you got assent from everyone on that, and I think that no one has a comment on the use of going for technical changes, which I think is really interesting, since presumably that is a strategy that a lot of the grantees use as going along that path. Next question.
I appreciate the comments about technology, and so I guess I want to ask in a different way. We've talked a lot about various kinds of best practices and really looking at capacity, but then what could we be doing in philanthropy better than what we're doing? Given, if we look at this as a big soup, that we're all these different players, we want our grantees to take that vantage point. What should we be doing differently and better to really push the kinds of policies we care about, or systemic change?
I think we've touched on them, but I'll just mention 3 basically. I mean, I do think, frankly, the overall message that's implicit in this, that policy matters, and that the foundation community believes that, and that it's willing to support that amongst its grantees, is a really critical starting point. And, each foundation will make its own judgment, but I do think, the Alliance for Justice folks have been very important in starting to distill what actually policy change is, what you can do, what you can't do. But the conservatism that sometimes exists in the philanthropic community, which, I'm not trying to make any judgment, but to the extent that there's actually, a belief that that is something that we're after, to be able to articulate that and have that be shared is incredibly important, because grantees obviously need to do so, need to feel comfortable that they're not going to end up adversely affected if that's what they do, with all of the risks that I guess are now the chart that we're going to keep up. I like the other one better in terms of what it is, met failure there is a little, the second piece that I would say is actually about how we work together. Each of us in our own respective fields do or don't do sort of things. But, I think most of us would agree that the modeling we do, makes a difference. So if we as foundations in a particular area can get together and say, we actually ourselves are trying to figure out when and how we're jointly committed to advancing policy change, that can't help but send a message. And just to go back to the immigration field, again, predating my time, I very much, there's been enormously strong work done over a period of time that far predates 2002, 2007, 2008, with, I think, sort of collaborative structures, some of which work better. But that was all about sort of a collective belief that that's what was going to be necessary. And those types of things I do think have implications. And then the third is, there's a lot of complex things around which there aren't easy answers here. I mean, I don't want to set us up for an expectation that we're going to answer all of these questions, because some of them aren't answerable, but it is valuable to be digging into how do we seriously evaluate whether we did a credible job in the policy realm in a particular area? How do we share, what our boards or others expect of us to be able to say about what we did and didn't do in an area that is, Ricardo said, isn't susceptible to easy measurement. And, some of it's qualitative, some of it's storytelling, but, I think each of us probably have our own tactics or strategies of doing that, but, the more of that can be done, I think that.
I'd actually like to ask you a question, and then I'm going to encourage you, any of you, to ask one another a question. Oh, great. I didn't see it, Sarah. So my question, and then Sarah's, and then ask one of each other, is sort of merge those last two comments about both thinking about how you keep your board, particularly when you don't have a living donor who can take different approaches, how you keep your board engaged for the long haul, particularly when you collaborate, which often means not only are you sharing credit and that it all gets much murkier, but sometimes you have to be willing to compromise in your foundation's strategies, approaches, and even exactly how you define the goal. So how do you deal with that with the board, or have you? Then after anybody either answers that or you all say, no, thank you, we will go on to Sarah.
So to answer that, I feel actually quite privileged that I am at a foundation that, although we're still kind of going through many layers of transition and hitting a few reset buttons in different ways and are implementing the strategic plan, that our board is, that there's a very authentic push towards, everyone's on the same page. And I think that although it's, I have been experiencing sort of this beautifully complex, exciting mess that we're in that, we're focused on, youth, communities of color, basically the folks that we believe have been either intentionally or unintentionally underfunded, not funded, not prioritized within a larger, what's perceived to be a larger sort of mainstream one-item agenda of the domestic LGBT movement. And so within that, there is a very, there's a curiosity and a very authentic interest in, supporting sort of new actors in new non-siloed ways, knowing that, young queer youth of color are living their lives in non-siloed ways. They're not, the work that probably some of the best work that we'll be funding in the future is likely not going to come to us in a traditionally wrapped LGBT package. And so it's sort of incumbent upon us to figure out, okay, how do we then tell our LGBT story that we need to tell, because that's the focus of our giving. So I find myself in this really interesting moment of sort of, having the space to sort of get your hands dirty in that, but then also really needing to be able to tell a very clear, clear story. And I think having the board is I think along for the ride. That let's see a year from now when we'll have sort of some stories under our belt and sort of see how we really worked through all that. So that may have been sort of as complex as my answer may have been as complex as the way that we're sort of dealing with it right now.
Well, our trustees serve up to 12 years. So they have a good long time to engage with the programmatic work, and we have program committees of the board, and over their 12-year tenure, they will rotate and serve on each of these programs. So there's a real engagement at the strategy development level with the board. And of course, we have board members who are experts in the fields in which we work, and they are often tapped for their expertise and for their guidance. So I think that A, they're quite involved with those issues, and B, they served for a while, so they have some time to look at sort of an arc of an initiative.
Hi, I'm Sarah Williams, and I advise a range of foundations on their giving. And there's a progressive family foundation that I've worked with for a long time that would like to do more on advocacy, but they don't have a Ricardo on staff, and they're very reluctant. They're interested in putting themselves out there, but they're reluctant to take risks unnecessarily, legally, and other ways. So it's very helpful to hear some strategies around that and ways to push the envelope. But I'm wondering if you or other people in the room have suggestions for smaller foundations about the legal capacity that some of the big ones represented here have, how examples of being involved in the public policy process. And then a separate question is just, I hear a lot from people working in Washington that focus is shifting more to states and governors and mayors as more receptive levers of change for public policy on domestic issues. And I'm wondering if any of you are changing your strategy given the state of our federal government. Thank you.
I'm happy to take a step. Just in terms of kind of your question, at the end of the day, board engagement or management, whatever phrase we're going to use, is probably worthy of a separate seminar. But my own view is that, it's all expectation setting. And I think it's really important to be able to explain what everyone means by engagement in policy. What is the time horizon we're talking about? What are the ups and downs? What is it that you think an effort to engage in something that may be tactical in nature, but how does that fit with the long-term strategy of what one's trying to do? This is somewhat self-evident, but that avoids setting yourself up for, other stuff. And, because, well, we have a living donor, an influential and active living donor. We have a board, and like Ricardo's at board, it's made up of a bunch of very savvy, sophisticated experts. And to my mind, the question that they ask and should ask, and I encourage them to ask, is, okay, what can we do? And it's the clarity, not by denying the seriousness of the issue, but the explanation of, okay, there's lots of stuff we want to influence in the world. What is it, and where is the time horizon? Where is the capacity? Where is the insight that's going to make a difference? And if I can start with them, articulating that, then I don't think it's a hard sell to actually get involved. It's not easy, but I think there's a desire all of us have to be able to move that way. Yeah, with that said, just in terms of OSF at least, we're an international foundation. Obviously, the U.S., remain very involved in D.C. Our C4 is based there. We have a D.C. staff, a fairly significant portion. But, I think our belief is that, place matters. And I'm not trying to view it as much as a chef. We have a new initiative that's called the Open Places Initiative. It's looking at the local level. Like everybody else, we're looking very hard in terms of democratic practice of what's going on in voting rights at state and local levels. So, I view it as just a natural evolution. It's once again where it is, the one of the difference in particular areas. So some of it's national in scope, some of it's local scope.
To say something like, I'm so glad you asked the question about the small progressive family foundation, because I think that is a real untapped resource for a lot of the policy efforts that exist around the country. And precisely for the reason that you stated, which is they're sort of concerned about risk and legal and otherwise, et cetera. But it would be great if the sector could find a way to deploy those resources in a way that makes them feel more secure about doing it. So, for instance, I think small family foundations like the one you mentioned should probably team up with other foundations of a similar size or maybe bigger. Right? There are ways to create donor collaboratives. Right? They could create a fund at Tides or Proteus or a similar public charity, right? And sort of together form some advisory board and work jointly on those efforts there. But I completely, this is an issue I've thought about a bit because first I think that small family foundations are often not advised at all, or if they're advised, they're ill-advised by an accountant who set them up, and and I just think it's really an untapped resource.
And we have some in this room, as we know. So there are clearly, folks who do come and figure that out. And Kenneth wanted to add to that.
Yeah, just on your second question, in terms of federal, state, and local. Before doing the literature review, I did an internal needs assessment, so that was sort of the beginning of the process. And I did it across the foundation. And certainly in the area of education leadership, which is what I focused on in my remarks, there's been devolution, and that seems to be something that is a long-term trend. So that's one thing that we noticed, and so that we're recognizing that as being a reality in the context of framing our policy engagement work. Second thing is that, besides just the money, when you look at what the administration, the current Department of Education, is focused on, we went back to looking at the federal policy itself and how things flow down. No Child Left Behind was looser on goals, tighter on the how, whereas Race to the Top is tighter on goals, looser on how. So how that ultimately folds into policy considerations is important to recognize that change. And so we're trying to look at all those as we're framing these, and then figuring out how does that impact policy goal setting, our tactics, et cetera, within the foundation.
So I'm going to ask you each to think of either the next program you think we should have, the conversation that we should be starting that we haven't yet started, or any other final comment that you'd like to make. But before you do, I'm going to do one completely self-promotional thing, which is to say that over the last several years, we at Philanthropy New York have created several different working groups. Actually, started when Janice was at Rockefeller, and we received a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, which gave us room to really start thinking about how to do that work. So we have working groups that have some of the large national funders in them, but also have several smaller funders who are actually coming together to collaborate around policy goals. Sometimes just education and sometimes actual activities. And so I hold that out as another way for people to think about how to engage and to take the first step in an area that they have an interest in. So with that, and maybe we'll start the other direction. We'll end up with Kenneth, and we'll start with Ricardo.
Okay. Really, the other order was better. No, I really don't have any grand final concluding remarks, other than to say that, you know, I do think it's very important to enable this type of work, and that the timidity that I often encounter is surprising to me. So someone has been very effective at communicating what you can't do without trying to counterbalance that with actually what you can do, because the restrictions, to my mind, are actually quite narrow, and there's so much that can be done. Just one example, because very few people know about this exception to the lobbying restrictions, and that is jointly funded projects. If you are going to jointly fund a project with government, right, you can actually lobby the government to allocate funds for that. It's, you know, I don't know where in the regs, it's buried somewhere. And no one, I mentioned this to someone the other day, and they were like, no. I said, okay, well, we can call up the regs. I'll show you. It's right there. So there are lots of things that people aren't aware of. So the staff person wanted to know, can I go talk to legislators in state X? I said, well, if you are genuinely contemplating a funded program with the government, and you need to weigh on the legislature to allocate funds for it, yes, go for it. Huh?
It's really interesting. I'm not aware of that.
Yeah.
Really, that's fabulous. Great.
Given that policy to left-wing our strategic plan is cheesy to me to volunteer people exercises, but these are for people who have, you know, a clear sense of how they want to push the policy. They understand the law very well, and they're pretty sophisticated practitioners. And we have a membership that, you know, to Sarah's question, sort of struggles with it. Maybe it's not technically a volunteer them, but, you know, sort of maybe an issue brief on this, sort of unpacking the law for people.
And I'm sure that all of them would be eager to help and support that. So thank you, guys. Thank you. Ken. Whatever you want with your
well, no, I mean, I enjoyed it. Thank you for it. I'm just going to volunteer Ricardo. Okay, that's okay. So we're good. No, I mean, I think that I'm not sure I've got any grand thoughts. I do think that, you know, I'm still relatively new. I think at the end, I realize each foundation is different. It's got its own culture. You know, so the two short things I'd say, especially for the larger foundations, the ones that are better staffed. I think Ricardo's point that, you know, in the funding collaboratives that we create, creating space for those that are less staffed, especially the Progressive Family Foundations, is something that I think is a way we can do a better job of assisting others to come on board, and just can be a effective strategy. And, you know, I guess just because it's something I'm spending time, our self-awareness, when it is that we put ourselves forward and when it is we put our grantees forward, I think just to put some finer points on it, it's not like it's, I think, zero cost when we put ourselves forward. You know, on some level, when we go meet with legislators or go meet with, you know, folks in the White House or whatever it is, We are doing that in some respects in ways that displace our grantees from doing it on the same issue. And I'm not saying that's bad or good. I just think that there's a need of awareness that when you do it, you're sort of taking on a responsibility to be able to follow through, to be able to figure out if that's good for what you're trying to do in terms of the field that you're in. And there's a lot to unpack in that, if that's the issue that you're grappling with. I would just urge people to try to be as mindful about as possible.
I have like three points. There are things that I've sort of said before. So I'm actually just going to segue. Your point is so important. I think that, you know, my last plug, I guess, would be to, you know, as much as possible in policy work and long-term advocacy or engagement work that anything that you do, is, you know, just I think having as a backdrop and keeping those in the approach that point around, you know, people who experience a problem have a pretty good perspective on how to solve it. And so how to integrate that and how to, you know, kind of take on where you can be an effective spokesperson or where you really can set the stage to get, you know, folks who live issues every day or are working in communities to build, you know, constituencies around these issues where it makes sense to really, you know, kind of have them be the credible messengers. Kenneth, you started us off.
So just a couple of things. One, I think, is that the concept of humility, I think, is very important in this work. And so there probably are still, just thinking about the lit review and the research, more questions than answers. But Ken has identified something that I believe the looking at, and this is also part of a risk management strategy too, about and reputation, all those things. When the foundation gets out there publicly, when the grantee is supported to be out there doing the advocacy work. But I will add a second dimension to this, which is also something that we could explore possibly here, which is the notion of collaboration and looking at when you collaborate with other funders, because reputation risk and mitigation of that risk by having other funders participating can also be something that is part of a broader foundation strategy. And that requires, I mean, that's not something that we as a foundation with Wallace can answer on our own. I think, you know, what are those techniques, and just even in terms of managing people with different definitions of, you know, what it is that they're doing. The goals may be slightly different, or they may be very different. And how do you negotiate that in the real world, given that so much of this in the policy world is about responsive activities. And so in terms of doing that in a way that moves something forward and is productive, I think that could be an additional element.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and we will definitely have a session on collaboration. We've actually been trying to study one of our collaboratives over the last year, and we hope at some point in the next year to be able to sort of share what worked really well and what was more complicated than we had originally anticipated. Another way of not using that word failure, just saying it was tough. But please join with me to thank our panelists. This has been a wonderfully informative session. So thank you all, and we welcome your thoughts about what else you would like to hear or have conversations around in the policy area. Thank you all.